Republican. The state of Michigan, these are really thin margins that the Democratic candidate faces in this state.
You know, I think one of the beautiful things about our state is how diverse we are. And when I've talked to people who have, lifted up their voices and said that, look, the current administration is not articulating where they think we should be, I have to respect that. People's vote is their voice. And I know people who live in this state who have family members who are overseas in Palestine who are hurting and they're grieving their loved ones. I can't make a case that they should be supporting anyone that they don't believe is articulating and expressing where they believe our country should go. The same is true for many of my friends and colleagues who are from the Jewish community, who they are seeing a rise in anti-Semitism. If you look at this through a humanitarian lens, I think we're all wanting some type of end and some type of peace. But I will also say this, the nuclear option is not voting. I think that just like with any other relationship, we're not going to think that everything is perfect every day. But when I look at where the Biden administration has been in totality, not only with this particular issue, and we can talk about where we all think we should be going, and a ceasefire is exactly where I think we should be, but I look at how this administration has also shown up for me and for people that I care about. And so I'm excited to support the president in November, and I hope that we take a more nuanced position on where we think our leadership is going moving forward. Because for folks who are uncommitted, I think it's important to know that they aren't going to get anything different with Donald Trump. And I think that that's a clear indication that the nuclear option is to just sit home and not have a voice in this election.
Professor Matt Grossman, I mean, Joe Biden is facing problems with his base in this state. It's not just Arab American voters. Young voters in Michigan have been protesting about what's happening in Gaza. He's lost support among people without a college degree, minority ethnic African American voters. So, I mean, this issue could be a really big issue for him when it comes to the November election.
Absolutely, we'll have another close election, and any of these factors could swing. And the overall difference between this time and the previous time is that Joe Biden is less popular. And so there are a lot more voters that dislike both candidates than there were last time. I do think people outside of Michigan may misunderstand a little bit whether about the Arab American community is that I wouldn't necessarily call it part of the base automatically. In fact, in the last election, the Dearborn area actually moved towards the Republicans as the rest of the state was moving towards Democrats. It had nothing to do with Gaza. It was about cultural conservatism and LGBT folks in schools. So it's a constituency that could be a swing constituency, and this is a factor that could move that to the Republican side. In terms of young people, absolutely it's the case that Biden has lost support among young people, and it's not clear that he'll be able to win them back in 2024 and that Biden might need to carry the state.
John, let me just come to you as a Republican.
We're electing the commander-in-chief, and this factors in because this is perhaps the biggest crisis in the world right now. Yeah, I have mixed feelings. I was in the very kibbutz in August, before October 7th this year. And I mean, I frankly don't understand what anybody expected was going to happen after October 7th. Israel has a right to defend itself. But I also go to a church where every Sunday we're praying for the people of Palestine and the people of Israel. I mean, it's a complicated thing, and I don't think anybody wants to see just flat out genocide. But Israel has a right to defend itself. It's got to end somewhere.
Jennifer, let me come back to you. What's the strength of feeling on the issue amongst union members in your community?
Sure. So SEIU has an unequivocal position that we should have a ceasefire now. I will say this is absolutely a national issue. I think that we can all play a role as moral leaders. Islamophobia is wrong. Anti-Semitism is wrong. We have seen, to Senator Anthony's point, a rise in anti-Semitic events in this state that are unacceptable, including against elected officials, which are unacceptable. Regardless of how you feel about them, that's an unacceptable avenue of attack. What I will say is this November, I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. have protested every president in my lifetime, including the ones I voted for. That's my job. That's my job as a citizen. So, you know, I will say Reagan wasn't my fault. That was my mom taking me. But I have protested the presidents I voted for to make them do better. No offense to the elected officials who are with us tonight, but they're just like humans. They're not perfect. It's my job to push them, and I think it is our job as citizens to push them to always do better and do the right thing. Because then none of them are perfect. I think the consequences of this election, you know, to Sarah's point, we do have a binary choice in November, and they aren't necessarily the options that I would have picked, but they're the choices I now have as a voter, and I'm gonna pick Joe Biden.
So, Sadiq, can I come back to you? Because you are talking about the uncommitted movement, you know, the people who made sure to send Joe Biden a message that we're going to turn up to actually fill out the ballot, but we're going to vote uncommitted. And you heard the panel saying that's kind of the worst thing you can do. You do need to vote in this election. Are you going to vote?
To be honest, like, I still haven't decided, right? Because Senator Anthony said that the nuclear option would be not to vote, right? But when I watch U.S. bombs basically falling on children, that's what I call the nuclear option. Like, I don't want to start crying out here because, like, when I watch the news, when I see what's happening in the world, right, that is our tax dollars. That is the U.S. supported genocide.
Well, Israel would not call it a genocide, and there's been a lot of debate about that. I'm just going to put that in there.
Israel's not here. I call it genocide. I see it as genocide. And even our Republican senator here, he said that Israel has a right to defend itself. But does it have a right to defend itself? It means genocide. But we're not blind. We see bombs falling, and we're supporting that. Our tax dollars are supporting that. Yeah, I can't, like, good conscience support Joe Biden, right? I don't believe Donald Trump is better, but then it puts me in an awkward position of feeling like they don't represent me. So, what can I do?
I'm sure it's going to be exactly. Sadiq, thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists on that. Let's go to our next question, which comes from Janet.
Hi, I'm Janet Arcucci, and my question is, when are we going to regulate social media platforms the way that Europe has? The lack of traditional media has left a major void in all areas of Michigan specifically, and what has filled it is the hate on all of the social media platforms and the algorithms and things, and I know that there's been some effort in Europe to regulate.
Caitlin, let me come to you first. Social media, big issue?
Big issue. Big issue. I'm not one to say that information should be tamped down. I don't think that's generally the best course of action. With social media, I think, it has organically gotten to the point is that I remember joining Facebook when it first came out, and you could get college addresses and everything. It was a very exciting time. But now we have grown into a monster, and I don't necessarily know the right answer. I think when you get to platforms like TikTok, where there's foreign influence, where algorithms are being manipulated, data privacy concerns, especially adolescents with mental health, they're addicted, and their self-esteem, depression, suicide. I mean, all of these horrible things that are coming from an addiction to social media. You can just kind of see our body politic changing as we get more and more invested. And I include myself in this because I have little kids at home and I'm caught staring at my phone all the time. And I think, what am I doing? This moment is passing. So I think it's a huge issue. I think we need to take these concerns really seriously. Congress has looked at trying to strong-arm TikTok and China into being more responsible with its algorithms. I think young people in particular get convinced that this is just something that's popping up because everyone thinks it's popular.
Sarah Anthony?
I completely agree with everything that Caitlin mentioned. The other thing I will say, though, is that social media has brought a voice to many voiceless communities. It has created community. It has created a synergy around protest movements. When I look at, Twitter and how it has been a gathering space, how Black Twitter, whether it has been for mobilization, when I think about the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, when I think about during the height of COVID and how many of us utilize social media to share real information, young people are leading the way in terms of utilizing social media, not just for the latest dance craze or for goofy videos, but for also protests, for also gathering in order to really impact systemic change. So I think that, yes, there's obviously some guardrails that I think government and other entities need to put forward, but it has created to elevate in those spaces. And so it is a positive thing to utilize social media to uplift perspectives that often are overlooked and dismissed.
Senator John DeMuse, do you agree with that view that it's been a great leveler, or do you see it as more of a problem?
I think it's good or bad. I mean, actually when Thomas Edison invented the movie camera, it was a technologically neutral thing, but they really wrestled with this because it can be used for tremendous good or tremendous evil. This is how I see social media. But a lot of this can't be subcontracted out to the government. I mean, this does go back to families. We have a 10-year-old at home who is absolutely, you're right, the word addiction, it's scary. And he's watching video shorts all the time. Then we'll hear a swear word, Henry, you gotta move it. Henry, you gotta move it. You can't watch it. You know that phone's gonna get taken away if you keep going. But as much as I'm worried about content, I don't know how you curate that or ban that or anything like that, especially with our First Amendment, things like that. I'm actually worried about just the very existence of social media. I mean, he has a hard time concentrating on long things. We tried to watch a movie the other day and he was bored within 5 minutes, and so we realized, oh, we got a problem here.
Jennifer?
I think part of the question was around kind of the disintegration of kind of more traditional media, and I would say that's something I find really alarming. As someone, again, I grew up spending my summers on a rural farm in Van Buren County, Michigan, and we had a county paper that came, and truth had value. The reporters were folks we knew, and they were in the pursuit of truth, and so I think that is also something we have to balance this with. I'm with folks here, not sure how we regulate. I think a lot of it is, parents making good choices and sending kids outside is, again, I feel old now, but just like go outside until the sun goes down, and so I think that's part of it, but I do think that we need to invest in actual journalism and make sure that we have watchdogs, because that's how I feel like I grew up, as the media, both locally, nationally, in my state, is as a watchdog, and I think that's missing, and I think that impacts this as well.
Let's hear from the audience. Would you guys like to see more regulation of social media? Let's go to the lady in the green shirt.
My name is Abby. I live in Lansing. I'm a state employee. In all fairness, I heard about this event on social media. So I do want to say to the parts where there are good things in social media, it's what brought me here tonight. My concern is the disinformation and the impact. Hearing you say that, we see lots of misinformation, and that happens all over the place. It happens in traditional media, it happens in mainstream media, it happens in many places. My biggest fear with this social media and where we need to think about going is disinformation. Purposeful lies put out there to destroy the fabric of the democracy of this country, and we're watching this happen. It's disinformation, and it's meant to destroy us, and that's what I'm more concerned about than the misinformation.
Okay, thank you. Just before we come to this gentleman, there were other hands up towards the back. I'm keen to get some other. So let's get that microphone going right to the back. Go ahead, sir. You go ahead.
Michael Unsworth. I'm from a Lansing suburb. The biggest concern I have with social media and the companies in general is how insidious they are at finding out about us.
So data privacy.
Daily privacy. They're gaining all this information from us with very little reward for us. And I'm not sure if regulation is the answer, but something has to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go to one more comment here.
Thank you so very much. My name is Adam Bayero. I work with the school district. I'm also an immigrant. So my question concerning the social media and regulation is, how do we regulate hate speech that is particularly coming from authorities, those underground? Because as an immigrant, we are posting videos. So what videos see authorities, former presidents who say who says all sort of negative things. I would not like to put that here because it's considered offensive. How do we control the speakers coming from other countries? Thank you so much.
Okay, well, she's just brought that right back to us. How do you regulate? How do you regulate if a presidential candidate says a particular community ought to be, banned from the country or whatever? I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but I imagine it's something along those lines.
You don't elect them.
Shannon, thank you very much for your question. Obviously, a lot of things to say on that. Let's go to our next question from Matt. Our final questions.
My name is Matthew Vogt. My question is, do you believe there should be an age cap for the presidency?
Wow, right. So Joe Biden is 81, I believe. Donald Trump is 77. There are a lot of other very prominent U.S. lawmakers who are in their 80s, 90s. I have heard people outside the U.S. talk about how when you look at the national landscape, it feels like it's becoming something of a gerontocracy. I don't think that's an official thing. Should there be an age cap on the presidential candidates? Jennifer, what do you think?
We are blessed with 20-something legislators here in Michigan. But I will say no, is what I would say. I believe voters should have all the choice in the world. They should elect who they want, when they want. And if they want to elect a 90-year-old, if that's the will of the people, then that's the will of the people. It may not be my choice, but I think I don't think we should artificially limit that for voters.
Does anybody on the panel think that their age affects the way that they connect with the electorate? Sarah Anthony?
The presidency is also the people that he or she puts around him, right? And I think that when I look at the products that have come from this administration, I don't care how old it is. I don't care how old the candidates are. It's about the issues that impact me and my family and the trajectory of our country. And when you look at who this president has surrounded himself with, it's inspirational. When I look at the fact that under his leadership, bringing on the first African American and the first woman vice president is telling. And I think that when you bring people around you with fresh perspectives and diverse perspective and ideas, ultimately the president does matter. But as Jennifer Root mentioned, I think it's also important to give people whatever options that are before them.
John DeBeers.
Well, I absolutely do not think we should put an age. I mean, I think that's an age restriction on it. I think that's the height of ageism and all these things we've been trying to eliminate. But we have restrictions on this. And again, so much of this goes back to us as people. I mean, not as elected officials. If you think someone's too old for the job or not healthy enough for the job, don't vote for them. I think by putting one thing though is Muslim cultures throughout history have benefited so much by the wisdom of ages. I mean, you do gain a lot of experience and a lot of good ideas. And the bottom line is, 80 years old to one person is not 80 years old to another person. I mean, we have to have some common sense on what works. But just universally banning someone because they're over 80, I can't see any circumstance where that's not just flat out unconstitutional.
Matt, I wonder why you asked that question. For you, is it an issue, the age of the two candidates? Do you feel that it somehow impacts kind of what they're offering?
Yeah, I think so. I think with especially their two current candidates that we've talked a lot about tonight, they're both older, in their late 70s, early 80s, and I think there's questions about their mental acuity. There's questions about can they keep up with the demands of the job, and also talking about Congress. The average age of a member of Congress is very high, a lot higher than the average age of the U.S. population. So I think it just begs the question. It's an interesting topic to ask about.
And do we think, Caitlin Buss, let me come to you, do we think that this is partly because young people aren't getting into politics? I mean, maybe we have the people that we get because we don't participate.
I think young people have been frustrated with the candidate pool, but at the same time, I think there's a reason that the founders put an age minimum and not an age limit on the presidency and the Constitution. And if it drives more younger people into activism and politics, that's probably a good thing, and we need some people with energy in there for sure.
And Professor Grossman, I know that you have actually talked about this issue, haven't you, on your podcast, the age of presidents and whether or not this matters. What do you think?
Well, you're not imagining it, and it's not just the presidential candidates. Congress is very old and getting older. Our legislatures are older than other comparable countries, and it is the political participation ratio for age is even more prominent in other aspects, like do you show up to a meeting, do you participate in low turnout election? Quite a bit of evidence that it matters to the outputs of government that older people are much more represented than younger people.
Well, I can see a lot of hands going up, and I will go to the audience now, and I wonder if you think there should be a sort of compulsory retirement in politics. Let's go to the gentleman there with the blue shirt who had his hand up.
I don't think there should be an age limit. There should be a quality of character issue, quality of character limit.
Okay, that would be hard to do, wouldn't it? Okay, let's can we just run over to this gentleman here, the blue-green shirt here?
Hi.
Do you want to say how old you are?
62.
Okay.
My name's Stuart Brinke. I'm a retired attorney. I think part of the problem is, and I think Professor Grossman alluded to this, that it's not just the presidents. People in Congress who've been there for so long. And I'm not in favor of term limits. I'm not in favor of any age gap. But it's that sort of sense of entitlement of a politician that person has been there for so long. Really, politicians should be respective of a little more temporary custodianship, if you will, of participation in a legislature or in government. And I think it's incumbent upon them to say, look, I've been here 20 years, it's time to pass the torch to someone new. But you have a lot of politicians who linger on. It's incumbent upon the population, the electorate, to remove them when they feel that a change of leadership is required. But I think it's also a perspective that has to be taken by the politician that I've done my time, I've provided my service, and I have to pass the torch.
Right, thank you very much. Let's go to the lady right there in the back end.
How about instead of the age, we switch the gender? How about let's try with the women? But we have a women in power. We will have a women president in this country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, lady right in the back with the blue shirt.
Hey, my name is Barbara. Coming from like a young person perspective, in the age cap, I think it's important that we think about age does not necessarily come with wisdom. And just because you old, like
Barbara, do you mind saying how old you are?
Oh, I'm 21. I'll be 22 next week.
Okay. And are you gonna vote? Are you planning to vote? Are you planning to vote?
Oh yeah. Yeah. But I also want to make sure that we are aware of how young people perceive the politics and how we speak for ourselves, and how it's not necessarily as easy to run for office and everything like that. I know it costs a lot of money. I mean, for president, for local elections, for everything it costs money to run. Our generation, we don't really have the buffer as much to run and to get the money to get out there. So we have to keep all those things in mind. It's not as
okay. Let's get one more comment right here in the front row. Right here.
I agree that the war chest, they're always talking about the war chest, millions of dollars that our big politicians are getting monthly, quarterly. How are these young people who have ideas and want to participate, how are they expected to even get there? We don't invite them. You have to get in there and do it, but you can't do it unless you got a lot of money. Who's got that? Normal people, not politicians who have built up their war chest. They don't have them. So how do we expect, we want our young people, like to get there and get their ideas going. My God, that's who's going to inherit us in our country as the young people. So they should start being able to speak up, have some results, feel like they're participants, welcome participants.
Thank you so much for that. That's a really brilliant note to end on. Thank you so much. That's all we've got time for, unfortunately, here on World Questions in Lansing, Michigan. Really want to thank everyone for the warm welcome. On behalf of my producer, Helen Towner, and the whole of the BBC World Service, a really big thank you to our panel. Really fantastic group of guests here on the stage, and to our hosts here at the Lansing Center. I want to thank all the people who submitted questions, our questioners, and the entire audience for coming along. And for anybody listening anywhere out there in the world, thank you so much for joining us. Now, next month, the program comes from the Mongolian capital, Ulaanbaatar. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.
This is the BBC World Service, and on the inquiry this week,
I'm Tanya Beckett. A law that threatens to stifle the voice of democracy through a small country in Eastern Europe off course in its bid to join the EU. This week we're asking, is Georgia turning its back on Europe?
The inquiry at bbcworldservice.com/inquiry.
In half an hour,
BBC Trending.
a photograph of a pro-Russian banner at a farmers' protest in Poland sparks an outcry online. Some say it points to the potential involvement of Russia in the protests. Others disagree. What can we find out?
From our own correspondent is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
On From Our Own Correspondent after the news, the voices of voters around the world.
Indians venting their views without fear. Ashok Kumar explained loudly why he disliked the Prime Minister. I asked him if it was okay for us to broadcast his interview. Of course, I'm free to say what I want, he replied.
South Africans choosing a change.
I met a young man who had just completed his 3rd degree. I have never been employed in my entire life, he told me, outside the Durban city. He was queuing to vote, driven by his disappointments.
And Mexicans who want a woman to lead.
For every woman in the Valley of Linga, there were another 10, maybe another 100 or 1,000 who had to stay at home and work the fields that day. They would surely be turning out on voting day, marking their X next to Claudia Sheinbaum's name.
All that and more From Our Own Correspondent with me, Pascal Harton. After this bulletin of BBC World News.
Hello, Rob Neil Nunes with the BBC News. The European Union's top diplomat has condemned the killing of Palestinians in the Israeli military operation to rescue 4 hostages held by Hamas from a refugee camp in central Gaza. Joseph Borrell welcomed the freeing of the hostages, but said that reports of what he called another massacre of civilians were appalling. Israeli forces backed by airstrikes fought intense gun battles with Hamas in and around the Nuseirat refugee camp. Israel's military spokesman Daniel Hagari said the operation had been a success.
Israeli forces have been preparing for this rescue mission for weeks. They are underwent intensive training. They risked their lives to save the lives of our hostages.
Anti-government protesters in Israel have clashed with police as rallies were held across the country to call for early elections and a deal to secure the release of the remaining Israeli hostages held by Hamas. Police made more than 30 arrests and used mortar cannon to disperse crowds. Here's Hugo Machida.
Here in Tel Aviv just hours ago there was a huge protest with thousands of people demanding a deal with Hamas for the remaining hostages to be free. Many of the people here have been urging the Prime Minister to accept a proposal that was laid out by President Biden last week, a proposal that would see not only the release of the remaining hostages but would also pave the way for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza.
There are reports that a cargo ship has caught fire off the coast of Yemen after being struck by a missile. The fire has been extinguished and no injuries have been reported. Houthi rebels in Yemen have launched dozens of attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden since November last year, claiming that these are in support of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. A surge in tourists visiting Japan has caused critical shortages in aircraft fuel across the country. Government sources say the demand for fuel from international flights has outpaced the production capacity of refineries as Japan grapples with the challenges posed by over-tourism. We get more now from Kat Weiner.
More than 20 million people visited Japan last year, mainly to the key cities of Tokyo, Kyoto and Osaka, as in other tourist hotspots across the world. Such over-tourism is raising concerns about sustainability and the impact on local communities. Residents in Kyoto, a city known for its adherence to traditional Japanese cultural values, have complained of feeling swamped by visitors and angered by their behaviour. The slopes of Mount Fuji are increasingly congested and strewn with litter. The city of Osaka earlier this year proposed charging visitors an entry fee, something already introduced in the Italian city of Venice that has become a byword for over-tourism.
This is the latest world news from the BBC. Tens of thousands of opponents of the right-wing Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán have taken part in a rally in the capital Budapest. The leader of the centrist Tisza party, Peter Motyer, accused Mr. Orbán of turning the country into a family business. Argentina has said it has no information about the alleged presence in its territory of dozens of Brazilian citizens accused of being involved in riots last year. The Brazilian government says the attacks are a part of a coup attempt organized by the former right-wing president Jair Bolsonaro. Brazilian police say they are requesting the extradition of dozens of people who fled to Argentina since December, when President Javier Milei, a personal friend of Mr. Bolsonaro, took office. Major restoration work has begun in Sweden to protect the wreck of a magnificent 17th century warship, the Vasa, which is housed in a museum in Stockholm. More from Michael Duncan.
The 4-year project will right the hulk and provide a steel structure to support its weight. The lavishly decorated oak-hulled galleon was built to be the flagship of the Swedish Navy, but lasted only minutes into its maiden voyage. It was top-heavy, and it tilted as soon as it encountered a mere breeze. The ship then capsized and sank after water flooded through the open gun ports on the lower decks. The Vasa was finally raised from the seabed in 1961 and found to be almost completely intact. Since it was put on display, it's been one of Sweden's most popular tourist attractions.
Sunday marks the 90th anniversary of the cartoon character Donald Duck, who made his first appearance in a short Disney animation in 1934. The character is known for his perpetual bad luck and distinctive high-pitched and distorted speech. He's featured in more films than any other Disney character. BBC World News.
Hello and welcome to From Our Own Correspondent here on the BBC World Service. I'm Pascal Harton. Coming up on the programme, South Africa's election ends 30 years of unchallenged dominance for the African National Congress and forces it into a negotiating position. Also, La Presidenta, the first woman to win Mexico's presidency, and the voters who put her there. And it's all aboard a night train to join a rolling international community, sharing stories and making new friends. They call it a sleeper, but there doesn't seem to be much snoozing between Frankfurt and Vienna. First, the democratic earthquakes of the last few days that have left some of the world's most confident political parties rather humbled. We'll start with the most unexpected. In India, the governing BJP, led by Narendra Modi, was confident not just of winning, but doing so with a landslide. Mr. Modi had set a goal of 400 seats, but the BJP didn't even get the 272 needed for an absolute majority. He is still only the second leader in India's history to return for a third consecutive term, but his grip on the nation's politics has loosened. The opposition Congress Party saw an unexpected resurgence, even in the BJP stronghold of Uttar Pradesh. Yogita Limaye reflects on what the outcome says about the state of democracy in this vast nation.
About 2 hours into the counting of votes on Tuesday, the mood at the headquarters of Prime Minister Modi's BJP turned somber. The faces of the party's leaders, confident and beaming at the start of the day, grew more serious. Many sat in a huddle in a corner. You might find this scenario a bit odd, because trends were showing that the ruling alliance was on track to win a comfortable majority. But for Mr. Modi, it was a victory that felt like a setback. His party went into this election stronger than ever before, and with far better resources than any of its rivals in terms of funds and media coverage. But in the end, the BJP secured fewer seats than in either of the two previous elections they've won. It's damaged the aura of invincibility that has surrounded Mr. Modi for the past 10 years. A strongman leader diminished by the will of the people. More than 640 million voters in India delivered a verdict that few predicted. And whether you're a supporter or critic of Mr. Modi, it's hard not to marvel at the power of this exercise that the country undertakes every 5 years. Not just in scale, but in intent. I saw a small snapshot of how deeply the commitment to this democratic tradition is ingrained in Indian society. On the first day of voting, I was in a rural constituency in the northern state of Uttar Pradesh. From very early in the morning, I saw labourers, farmers, students and the elderly stream in, clutching their voter identity cards as they queued in the blazing heat. Dozens of policemen and paramilitary forces stood guard. Inside the booths, polling officers checked IDs against the electoral rolls, marked each voter's finger with a drop of ink, and then sent them to the voting machine where they cast their ballot. This exercise is remarkable because India is an outlier in a region where all of its neighbours have at some point or other had their elections plagued by rampant accusations of wrongdoing. But while electoral there is evidence of the decline of other democratic freedoms under Mr. Modi's rule. Critics have been jailed, press organizations raided, and protests cracked down. And as a journalist, I've begun to encounter more and more people who are careful about what they say. I was outside a university in the city of Meerut ahead of the election, filming with students who were praising Mr. Modi. A young man looked on, and later came up to me privately and said, asked him if he'd like to speak on camera. He agreed and went on to express his dissatisfaction with the Prime Minister. When we finished, he asked, "Will I get into trouble?" Will such caution and concern continue to grow? I wondered. The next day, I went to a nearby village. I flagged down a tractor and asked the farmer about his thoughts going into the election. A middle-aged man with big moustache and turban on his head, Ashok Kumar explained loudly why he disliked the Prime Minister. Several people from his village walked by. Okay, not concerned with who overheard him. I asked him if it was okay for us to broadcast his interview. Of course, I'm free to say what I want, he replied. Ashok told me he'd only attended primary school, but he clearly knew his rights under Indian law. 2 days after the results, I went to Muzaffarnagar, a constituency the BJP lost. A group of mostly elderly farmers sat around a large cowshed. Long-time supporters of Mr. Modi, this time they voted his party out. We've sent him a message, Chotan Seni said. The development they talk of hasn't happened on the ground. It's become hard to put food on the table. People had blind faith in him, but now they've started using their brains. Sometimes, observers here assume that only the well-educated understand or care about democracy. Meeting Ashok, Chotan, and so many others during the election was a reminder that the values outlined in the Constitution are quietly upheld by hundreds of millions of people in India each day. People who are prepared to use the power of their vote for change if a leader disappoints them.
Yogita Nimai. Voters delivered another serious challenge to the dominant party in South Africa. The African National Congress has been in power there for 30 years. The ANC commanded widespread loyalty, particularly among black voters, for its long struggle against apartheid. In 1994, when white minority rule ended and the ANC won its first elections, it promised to continue the work, striving for greater equality, housing, education, and economic opportunity for all South Africans. The country now suffers one of the world's highest unemployment rates and deep economic inequality. Many young South Africans saw this year's election as a chance for real change. 2024 is our 1994, became a popular slogan during the campaign. Now that its political monopoly has been broken, the ANC has to make deals and share power with some uncomfortable partners. And sorry.
South Africa is in uncharted waters. The Liberation Party has lost its grip on the country. Gone are the days when it commanded more than a two-thirds majority. This past election has left the African National Congress Party humbled, or some would say humiliated. Today, many South Africans feel it has let them down. For young people, nearly half of whom are unemployed, it is the lack of meaningful opportunities that was the real deal breaker. Last week, I met a young man who had just completed his third degree, a master's in food and nutrition. I have never been employed in my entire life, he told me, outside the Durban City Hall. He was queuing to vote, driven by his disappointments. I hope the vote will bring the change I want, said the 28-year-old. He was already in touch with academic researchers with hope that, should he fail to secure a job again, he could head back to class for his PhD. I don't want to just sit at home doing nothing, he told me. Days before the election, I headed to a jobs fair about half an hour's drive from Durban, in Dumlazi Township. Hundreds of young South Africans turned up at the community center, CVs and academic certificates in hand, at the invitation of the Ministry of Labour and Employment. Many went to the center looking for a job, but left empty-handed and disappointed. I've always voted for the ANC, but not this time, one woman there told me, clearly angry. The mood at the final African National Congress rally held in Johannesburg during the weekend before the vote was noticeably subdued. The 90,000-seater stadium had several hundred empty seats. 5 years ago, they'd filled up 2 stadiums on the same day with ease. This time, when President Cyril Ramaphosa rose to speak, those who had turned up began emptying their seats steadily. It didn't help that his speech went on for well over an hour, as photographs of manufacturing plants, engineers at work, and the country's power stations were projected on a giant screen. I wondered if he even noticed the crowd was ebbing away. He seemed oblivious to the visible drain in support. 3 hours away in Polokwane, however, the mood was very different. A sea of red filled another stadium, where the fiery former youth leader of the ANC, Julius Malema, stirred up the crowd. He left to form the Economic Freedom Fighters Party over a decade ago, after falling out with the ANC's leadership. He took with him a sizable chunk of its core, some would say radical, support base. He advocates for the nationalization of mines and redistribution of land to the majority black population. Land reform is something the former president, Jacob Zuma, now stands for too. He was by far the biggest disruptor in these elections. The man who was removed as the leader of the ANC over allegations of corruption and state capture 7 years ago made a dramatic political comeback that's been dubbed the Zuma Tsunami. The 82-year-old fronted a new party, MK, which, in just 6 months, grew to become South Africa's third largest, winning just over 14% of the vote. I met him in a presidential suite of a high-end beachfront hotel in Durban a few days before the election. Inside his suite, the show was run by a man who only introduced himself as an old friend of Zuma's, a 70-year-old French national. He wanted to make sure we only spoke about the elections and stopped Mr. Zuma from answering a question about corruption accusations. The former president was equally hostile and evasive in his responses. What is state capture? Am I guilty? He asked me, as he denied having had anything to do with the Guptas, a family of wealthy businessmen accused of making a slew of corrupt deals to access millions of dollars in government contracts, an allegation they have always strenuously denied. The ANC today is not the ANC I knew. It's a Ramaphosa ANC, Mr. Zuma said, vowing not to allow the party's current leadership to carry on running it. The party of Nelson Mandela must now negotiate with the opposition to form a government of national unity. But the largest of those parties advocate for vastly different policies on land, mines, and affirmative action. 30 years since the end of white minority rule, the ANC faces a hugely difficult choice, with only themselves to blame.
That was Anne Sawyer you were listening to from our own correspondent here on the BBC World Service. I'm Pascal Hart. Mexican voters also made history last weekend. They chose the country's first female president in Claudia Sheinbaum, a former mayor of Mexico City. She stood for the governing party, and the outgoing president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, backed her all the way. She's sticking to the same political line. This is still an upheaval. Machismo is strong in Mexican politics. The view that women and girls are less than still deeply held by some. Violence against women and girls is a major
major issue. The rate of femicide, the killing of women and girls because of their gender, is shockingly high. So there is much to do. Will Grant heard from many Mexican women who felt it was finally time for a presidenta.
When covering an election campaign, there's often a single moment or a specific conversation that convinces you far more than cold hard statistics that the race is all but won. That happened for me in the eastern state of Veracruz, where I'd gone to interview Sheinbaum on the campaign trail 2 weeks before polling day. In a leafy shaded park in the colonial city of Orizaba, Rosalinda put a human face to the nameless hordes of Sheinbaum supporters depicted in the news reports from Mexico. In a wide-brimmed straw hat, her greying hair poking out of the sides and dressed in an embroidered white blouse, the hours she'd spent waiting to see the candidate were nothing compared to the years she'd spent waiting to see a woman president. Claudia would be a good replacement to Andres Manuel, said Rosalinda, referring to Sheinbaum and President López Obrador as though they were old friends. Speaking as an indigenous rural woman, I'd say we need to keep supporting the countryside, because the president's aid plan, Sowing Life, has really helped, she added in halting Spanish before repeating her point in her mother tongue Nahuatl and added emphasis. It wasn't so much what Rosalinda said that afternoon which made me realise the presidency was almost certainly the Sheinbaum's. Rather, it was the realisation that for every woman at the rally like Rosalinda, there were another 10, maybe another 100 or 1,000 who had to stay at home and work the fields that day, but that they would surely be turning out on voting day, marking their X next to Claudia Sheinbaum's name. In an inauspicious back room of a hotel, where Sheinbaum addressed the main accusation against her from her opponent, Xochitl Gálvez, also. Claudia Sheinbaum would be the puppet of the authoritarian President López Obrador, argued Gálvez. Ridiculous, retorted Sheinbaum. AMLO, as Mexicans refer to President López Obrador by his initials, had built the foundations and the ground floor of a process of change in Mexico which their supporters called the Fourth Transformation, she said. Now we are going to construct a second floor upon those foundations he laid. Claudia Sheinbaum offered the electorate continuity with AMLO, particularly his popular social programs, and the voters accepted in their millions. By the time she was officially declared the winner, she'd outstripped even her more optimistic polls, with a lead of around 30%. Over the course of the night, her supporters gradually filled Mexico City's main plaza, the Zócalo, ahead of her first speech as president-elect. It's historic, completely, said Olivia, a woman in her 20s carrying a Mexican flag. It's for the women who are no longer with us and those who are still fighting, not just in politics, but anywhere we have convictions as women. On stage, Claudia Sheinbaum echoed a similar sentiment. I didn't get here on my own, we got here together, thanks to our ancestors, our mothers, our daughters and granddaughters. Women like Ermila Galindo. Born in 1886 in the northern state of Durango, black and white photos show a diminutive, determined-looking woman with defined indigenous features, her hair parted into 2 dark braids. Despite her traditional appearance, Galindo was 100 years ahead of her time. In 1915, she founded a magazine called La Mujer Moderna, a modern woman, which, among other things, campaigned against the Catholic Church's stranglehold over Mexican society. She travelled the country advocating for women's suffrage and promoting sex education in schools, radical ideas at the time. In 1917, she stood as a deputy in Mexico City, the first woman to run for office in Mexico. Today, for her work in challenging Mexico's long-held machista values, she appears on the 1,000 peso banknote. Back in the square, as the mariachis played and the party grew, I was struck by the importance of Claudia Sheinbaum's win for 2 little Mexican girls who weren't even born when she was elected as the first female mayor of their birthplace, Mexico City, 6 years ago. My 2 daughters, Isla and Maya, both fast asleep at home. For a moment, I put all the politics and electoral debate to one side, and I just enjoyed the spectacle for them. After all, you can't be the change you can't see. By coincidence rather than design, the vote was held on the 2nd of June, the anniversary of Ermila Galindo's birth 138 years earlier. Among the throng of revellers, a woman in a blue blouse and red-rimmed glasses stopped to talk to me. To see a woman who fought through the low to reach the presidency, it's so emotional. Her voice faltered a little. For me, it's marvellous. I think Ermila Galindo would have agreed.
well ground in Mexico City. Across Europe, there's a revival going on of sleeper trains. For some people, a really long train trip is a treat in itself, with a chance to look out of a window into hundreds of kilometres worth of back gardens, small towns, and rolling landscapes. If the journey lasted overnight, even better. But since the 1990s, with cheaper airfares and more short-hop flights, many countries abolished their sleeper train services. Passengers chose to get on a plane instead. It was faster, more convenient, and there were more options on offer. But now, with the European Commission and climate campaigners alike urging member states to do all they can to cut carbon emissions, some networks are relaunching sleeper trains. They're more cheap, they don't go everywhere, and you may not even get the chance to put your head down. All the same, Horatio Clare was delighted to join a rail renaissance.
Is there any more romantic way to travel than on a sleeper train, crossing dark countries and dreaming continents, rolling in and out of stations in the small hours, spanning rivers, tracing the shadows of alpine valleys? Journeying through Europe this way is the soul of travel and adventure. A cozy adventure too, with arms and seats, a couchette, and a dining car. You could watch fellow travellers toast the slumbering suburbs of the mighty cities. Investigating the history and future of night trains, I took one from Paris to Vienna. Or rather, I was booked on one, but it was cancelled, so by a different chain I chased another sleeper through the dusk of eastern France, via Strasbourg, up the Rhine to Frankfurt, and caught it on its way to Austria from Amsterdam. They date from the 1860s in the United States, courtesy of George Pullman's company, while in Europe, the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits was founded by Belgian businessman Georges Nagelmakers long afterwards in 1872. Nagelmakers resolved to create a luxury train which would cross Europe's borders in high style, from Paris to Vienna and thence to Istanbul, enter the Orient Express. Generations of Europeans like me have taken the trains ever since, although the passengers on the Orient Express were ever a financial elite. Romance, illicit affairs, espionage, and even murder travelled the Orient Express. In reality, it was the scene of just one homicide, Cold War era diplomat, but there were many more in books, films, and television, thanks to actors like Agatha Christie and Graham Greene. Reality was up late and making trouble with Corbin like Jet to Vienna from Frankfurt in the small hours. Reality decreed the train was full and my reservation for a couchette irrelevant. Dozens of us were forced to compete for places in those 6-seat compartments where you can pull the seats down to make a bunk in the middle if the train's not rammed, which it was. I still felt at home, having travelled the continent like this as a young interrater. I was in the minority. There were unhushed arguments in French and other languages as travellers disputing seat spaces and the chance of some sort of sleep. A young French couple, glamorous as film stars, in love as doves, curled around each other, holding hands. A young man alone dozed by the window. The rest of us fitted our legs and feet into what room there was, and Europe rumbled by in the dark like flashing objects of light, in tunnels, bridges. When the day came, we were in snowy Austria, and the French couple explained they had booked a couchette, hoping for a romantic journey, but they were still glad they'd come this way. Roman, the young man, said he felt he'd already used up his carbon allocation in flights, and thought it was his younger sister's turn in the air. He said he would offset her troubles by taking sleepers when possible. And then the police appeared, plain clothes, very alert. Papier, bitte. We took a hard look and asked questions of the young man by the window. A refugee, his documents revealed, and black, while inadvertently overlooking my passport altogether. His papers were in order, and they bid him good death. But it was a reminder that Georges Nagelmaker's great achievement with the Orient Express was the invention of a kind of moving, overnight, multinational country which transcended the rivalrous nation-states of Europe. You can talk to anyone on a night train. Since buying my first Interrail pass in 1992, a month of train travel then, for $156, I've gathered and told stories over decades, across the rail maps of Europe. We sat on luggage racks, shared food, and were intimate with our girlfriends and boyfriends, unforgettably once, in the hot lavatory as the train crossed the causeway into Venice. Ah, youth. But it is the magic of a travelling bed, when you can get one, and the simple fellowship of strangers who make and share the country of the night train, which is their real attraction. Nation shall speak peace unto nation was the BBC's old motto, and it is still mine. You get plenty of chances to do that on a night train. Here's hoping their comeback rumbles on.
Horatio Clare, up all night and learning plenty. That's all for this edition of the programme. Was Ollie Hope, and you can hear more stories from around the world, including thoughts on how reforming Russia's economy can backfire. That's on the From Our Own Correspondents podcast. And we'll be back again next weekend here on the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service, asking what can be done to reduce the enormous carbon footprint of the annual pilgrimage to Mecca.
Hajj cleanses your sins.
Millions of people go to Saudi Arabia for the Hajj, but climate change means that the conditions they find there are already challenging.
Pilgrims are facing extreme heat with temperatures reaching 48 degrees Celsius.
Scientists warn that the Hajj produces nearly 2 million tons of greenhouse gases every year.
The immediate impact is from aviation. Most people are flying in.
This huge pulse of people who go into the sanctuary and come out again, and the honking taxis and the carbon monoxide.
There wasn't much consideration of sustainability.
I'm Zubaydah Malik. I'll be asking what can be done to reduce the damage it does to the climate.
Creaming the Hajj, Thursday at 8:30 and 19 GMT.
A photograph of a pro-Russian banner from a farmers' protest in Poland sparks an online outcry. Some suggest possible Russian influence in the protests. In Poland, in the lead-up to the European elections, concerns were raised about attempts by Russia to influence the outcome. In this episode of BBC Trending, we'll investigate a photograph that caused an online furore. What might it tell us about anxieties linked to Kremlin meddling in Europe's farmers' protests? BBC Trending coming up after the latest world news.
BBC News with Neil Nunez. A senior official of the European Union has condemned an Israeli operation to rescue 4 hostages held by Hamas in Gaza, with Palestinian officials saying more than 200 civilians were killed. Josep Borrell said that the reports were appalling. Israel has said he should be condemning Hamas. There were emotional scenes in Israel when the hostages were reunited with their families. Meanwhile, anti-government protesters in Israel have clashed with police as rallies were held across the country to call for early elections and a deal to secure the release of the remaining Israeli hostages held by Hamas. Police made more than 30 arrests and water cannon used to disperse crowds. A surge in tourists visiting Japan has caused critical shortages in aircraft fuel across the country. Tokyo says the demand is outpacing the capacity of refineries. Ahead of European parliamentary and municipal elections on Sunday, tens of thousands of opponents of the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán have taken part in a rally in the capital Budapest. Major restoration work has begun in Sweden to protect the wreck of a magnificent 17th century warship, the Vasa, which is housed in a museum in Stockholm. The ornate galleon sank just 18 minutes into its maiden voyage. A cargo ship has caught fire off the coast of Yemen after being struck by a missile. The maritime security company Ambrey said the vessel was heading southwest along the Gulf of Aden at the time of the attack. Sunday marks the 90th anniversary of Donald Duck, who made his first appearance in a short Disney animation, The Wise Little Hen, in 1934. The cartoon character has featured in more Disney films than any other animated characters. BBC News.
It is stupid. It is not good. There is a powerful wind blowing from the east.
At the end of February, an image from a farmers' protest in Poland spread across social media. In it, a man can be seen driving a tractor adorned with a banner that says Putin, bring order to Ukraine, Brussels and our rulers, alongside a Soviet flag. When the photograph was released, it quickly went viral.
It got out to the world before the protest ended.
Polish media reports said police got involved by arresting and questioning the man behind it.
named only as Piotrzyk. And a day after the image made waves online, the spokesperson for Poland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a statement warning of attempts to take over the country's agricultural protest movement by groups possibly under the influence of Russian agents.
The words that came from the politicians regarding this case, but also other cases that happened around the same time,